Many thanks, Steve. And going over to Rushanara, please.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. I want to focus my questions on the impact of the crisis on the tax gap and avoidance as well as tax evasion. So starting with John, you say in your written evidence that tax evasion remains stubbornly high and that there's an insufficient deterrent or risk of getting caught. That's one of part of the explanation. What do you think HMRC could do to tackle that? And given they're dealing with the crisis as well, do you think that actually their capacity to address this issue has been further diminished?
Yes, I think they've been given a lot more to do, and I think broadly speaking, they've done it well. That was good reason why they were given it. But the fact of the matter is that puts their resources under more strain. I think, like anybody else, HMRC responds to the pressures under them. So the political pressures in the last few years have been, first of all, through public accounts type scrutiny. To be, if you like, be more like a private sector business, be very cost effective. The danger of that is, a private sector business will frankly prioritize its biggest customers, and it's very much easier for a multinational to get to be able to speak to somebody than it is for an ordinary person or a small business person, picking up the phone, if they need help. And
would you put a number on the scale of evasion as well as avoidance now?
I haven't got it yet, but the Revenue Zone published estimates year on year show that it'd be much more stubborn than other parts of the tax system. I don't criticise them for going after avoidance, but they have, on their own figures, kind of made more impact on that in the last few years. But I think there are other elements. There's certainly evasion. They have developed pretty smart technology to try and help them with this. But and I think they're getting more and more information that's statutorily required from banks and financial institutions globally, around the world. And they're getting more exchanges of information from other countries. I think their problem used to be not knowing what's going on. Now I think it's a data analytic problem. So I think there are areas they can invest in to deal with that problem. And there are other elements as well, like mistakes and errors. And there are problems with government's guidance. So there's a lot that can be done, I think, about the tax gap.
Okay. What about other panelists? Charlotte or Anita, do you want to add anything to those points?
Well, will I go first? I would completely support what John has said, and I think there's been a huge emphasis on avoidance, and take your hats off to HMRC. I do accept there is still one or two issues around the loan charge, and I accept that there's still cases going through the courts, but they're old. I think in large part HMRC have completely shifted the pendulum. There just isn't the tax avoidance that there was, say, about 10 years ago. They've done really well with that. But there is an issue, I think, if you look at the tax gap figures at evasion, and it still sits there. And I think evasion needs old-fashioned policing. It just needs kind of really careful looking at data analytics. MTD might help that. More traditional policing would help as well. The one other point I think I would like to make perhaps is that I think one needs to be careful about the messaging around avoidance, because if lots of the population think that folk are avoiding tax and they're not, they're just paying PYE, then you think, oh, what about me? And I think you weaken the system if you go on about tax avoidance too much, and the battle has been won. I would support too what John says about errors and mistakes, and I think a lot of those are completely innocent, and for a lot of smaller
I'm not really
taxpayers,
sorry.
Taxpayers with less money.
Sorry, Charlotte. With respect,
they need access to HMRC.
I appreciate that, but I'm particularly interested in those areas of legitimate concerns around both tax avoidance and evasion.
Yes, I think our position would be that avoidance, obviously it's legitimate, but it's not what it was. It's much less.
No, I'm talking about a legitimate concern in large amounts of avoidance, as well as, of course, evasion. And the point was particularly around evasion, that remaining a
evasion does
high
remain
risk suddenly
Yes, it
we're at
is.
high risk. Okay.
It is.
Anita, did you want to add anything on evasion particularly?
Yes, HMRC has very good systems, and these I think are still being built. Their Connect system gives them a lot of information about how profits of similar sorts of businesses in similar locations should be similar. I think because a lot of that is still in process, there is a time lag between collecting the information and doing anything with it. If we look at corporation tax, when XBRL was introduced back in 2010, HMRC gathered a lot of information, and 3 or 4 years later, they suddenly realized that for the sort of small, medium-sized sector of the corporate world, there was transfer pricing being used. And we always knew, I mean, it's perfectly legitimate, that's what happens. But clearly, they hadn't really thought about that as an area they should look at before then. So now they do. And I do think error and mistake are continuing problems. Following the COVID crisis, many of us are now used to going into a shop and being asked to pay only digitally.
Yep.
I think that's going to be throwing a lot more information at HMRC that they'll need to process.
And just on that, do you think that the fact that cash transactions have gone down so much because of this crisis, but can you say a bit more about how that's going to change the impact then it has in relation to bearing down indirectly, if you like, the avoidance as well as evasion?
I think it's a bit early for anybody to be able to speculate on that, particularly as we're sort of still in the middle of the crisis. I feel we're in the sort of eye of the storm at the moment. But undoubtedly, those businesses that are operating totally in cash will find that life becomes a lot more difficult the other side.
Okay. Just moving now on to the coronavirus response and the bailout. There's obviously been a great deal of concern about who gets the bailouts and so on. And there have been reports about bailouts going to certain companies that haven't been as good at paying the appropriate amounts of tax and so on. And there are some reports, like the one by Tax Watch UK, suggesting that 4.79 billion in bailout cash has been handed to companies with links to tax havens, or that they've been embroiled in financial controversy, and people like the president of the Chartered Institute of Taxation suggested that perhaps certain forms of conditionality should be attached to bailouts, and in other European countries that's been applied or considered seriously. Do you have a view on what we should be doing, and what in terms of what's happened so far? We all appreciate the necessities in a time of crisis, but how do you improve the behavior of those companies that have behaved badly in the past, given that they're getting large bailouts and hundreds of millions of pounds of bailouts? Who would like to come in?
I don't know. I'll come in.
Yeah.
I think first of all, in terms of what's happened, obviously the government and HMRC on their behalf had huge challenges in balancing speed of getting support out.
I'm familiar with that. If you could just get to the point about what this means and what we should be doing.
Okay, I think clearly there is a public appetite to challenge companies, where they, if you like, have skeletons in their cupboard in one area, from going and getting support in another.
Sure.
The challenges really are, around defining kind of what the bad behavior is in a way you can translate into law. So, what is your definition of tax haven? Because, sometimes you see quite wide, I've even seen Japan characterized as a tax haven in some of these articles because, it is weak on certain aspects of transparency, but it nevertheless is a reasonably high tax country. So you need to kind of define, exactly what the bad behavior is in a way that you can translate into law to make it a condition of something else. And there's an element of complexity in that, but I don't think anybody would deny there has to be a quid pro quo in terms of support. There's a job of work to do to kind of make sure it's.
Do you feel that the quid pro quo, apologies, is sufficient in terms of the bailouts that have been provided?
Well, I think.
Or could the government do more?
No, well, I think there are all sorts of ways you could criticise, in principle, the bailouts that have been provided, but we kind of knew that they were balanced on speed and what they had the systems to respond. So there are kind of elements of rough justice.
Sure, I get that, but do you feel that we could have learned from the last financial crisis when mass bailouts necessarily had to be provided to rescue the banks? And does it feel that it does seem to me that in a sense the lessons haven't therefore been learned if we're just talking about rough justice then?
Well, I think in terms of the support that was needed, it was a very different type of support.
Yeah, but there are some in principle factors, aren't there, about responsibility and conditionality that go with taxpayers' money being given to companies in the forms of bailouts.
Well, I mean, I understand with the financial crisis, not while it was not really that well expected, nevertheless, there had been contingency planning about bailing out banks and so on in the Treasury and jointly with the Americans. And, obviously a pandemic was identified, I understand, within government as one of the more likely kind of disaster scenarios. So I could see, learning the virtues of scenario planning. In terms of the specific lessons, the crises were so different that I'm not sure I can easily see that read across.
All right, thank you.